Hey, so I got vaccinated today. If I'm not gesturing a ton, my usual thing, I try to be expressive with my hands. It's because I got vaccinated. My arm is so sore, but the actual vaccination itself was not painful. I'll be honest, I do not like needles. I'm one of those people, and it was fine. I recommend everyone go get vaccinated, but yeah, it's going to be a single-handed type of thing today. Let's get into it. So today's topic is likely to be controversial. It's something I've thought a lot about, and it's why I don't think that free transit is a good idea. Now, I should define that. When I say free transit, I mean, universally free transit, the type of thing you see advertised on social media, like X city makes transit free for everyone. That type of transit I don't think is good in most places, and I'm going to tell you why. So cities around the world are constantly making waves, doing innovative things like implementing trackless trams, which is, I guess, the Australian term for those guided buses we see from China, and various other policies. Free transit, or universally free transit, if I can call it that, is one of those policies that I think gets talked about. It's very hot, it's cool to talk about, but I don't think it's actually a very good policy. Now, if you're like me, you've probably heard about cities kind of all around the world implementing free transit, or at least experimenting with it. And on the surface, it seems like a good thing, and it seems like it makes sense. If we already subsidize public transit so much, why not just go the extra mile and make it free, right? It also seems more equitable at first because, hey, people riding transit don't have to pay for it, right? So, should be fine. Now, I do think that there is potentially a good case for free public transit. Again, universally, I'm going to stop saying that, so before you write your comment, universally free. I think there is some places where that case for free transit can be made. I don't think that in places where the funding model or the operational model looks like North America, it makes a ton of sense. Reason one, many people, in fact, most people can and are willing to pay to travel. That's why in North America, so many people hop in a car every day and drive to work or drive to other things. Having a car, maintaining it, paying for gas, paying for insurance, and paying for tolls in some places, not to mention parking, is very expensive. And it's something that I think more people should think about, is comparing the cost of, how much would it cost me to own a car versus how much would it cost me to use transit in my city for a given year, for example. What I'm saying here is that transit does not need to be free to be competitive with the car. If you're providing a really good transit service, you could probably still charge a pretty high fare, and as long as the service is good, I mean, it's cheaper than a car, even if the fare is much higher than we have in North America at the moment. That being said, with much of North America having really poor quality transit infrastructure and poor quality transit service, does it really make sense to do this big financial reorganization of transit, the operating model, the funding model, when really what we need to be spending our resources on and focusing on generally is just better service and more infrastructure, something which we are slowly starting to do in places like Toronto. Number two, when you make something free, it distorts what people think of a certain service. People tend to forget the resources and the operations costs that go into creating a service, and that can be any service, but of course in this case it's transit. Now, North American transit is not particularly operational efficient, especially when you compare it to systems internationally. I mean, imagine the Hong Kong MTR. That system is incredibly efficient. You have a single driver, sometimes carrying a train with 3,000 people on it. But the truth is, transit doesn't just cost money to operate, but it has environmental impacts too. Now, those environmental impacts are not only greenhouse gas emissions either. They can just be generalized pollution. And there's resources that go into manufacturing transit vehicles. So if people start using transit for a lot of trips where it's probably unnecessary, but they do so because it's free, you're starting to use resources that you wouldn't have had to otherwise. That's not to mention that the cost of operating another bus because people are suddenly making tons of super local trips because transit is now free could be pretty substantial. Now, of course, it needs to be made clear that driving a car is way more inefficient than transit, but transit still isn't as efficient as walking or cycling, and having transit cost the same as walking or cycling doesn't really reflect that. Remember, walking and cycling require far less hard infrastructure, far less manufacturing, far less GHG emissions, and they provide a net social benefit in terms of health and other things. And so I do think it's important that we have a distinction here. And I think that doing things like subsidizing commuter bikes could be a good way of starting to create a separation so that people realize that, hey, cycling and walking are better for the planet than even transit. That being said, of course, cars are also way too inexpensive at the moment. The gap between transit and cars is far too close. Drivers should have to pay more for fuel because of all of the negative impacts of not only the GHG emissions, but as I mentioned before, the air pollution in general. In addition, parking should almost universally be paid because especially in dense areas, it's incredibly expensive to construct dense parking structures. I'm talking about parkades and multi-level structures. And it's incredibly expensive in terms of land if you have surface parking in various areas of a city, even in places that aren't all that dense. Of course, perhaps the biggest thing is the expensive road infrastructure. Urban highways should not be free to use. The Gardiner Expressway in Toronto is a great example of this. There are so many transit alternatives that people taking the Gardiner could use to get into downtown Toronto that it really shouldn't be free. Of course, tolling vehicles can be super fine-grained. If you have delivery trucks and the like that need to get goods to market, well, you don't have to necessarily charge them the same rate as a passenger car. You can be creative to try to push things in the direction that you think is best. Point 3. Those with low income or mobility impairments should have free transit. These folks are on the margins and they should not have to pay to use a public service like public transit. Modern smart card systems should make this whole process very easy. You have a transit card, you go onto a website, you fill in a form or something, and then you have free or heavily subsidized public transit access. And I want to interject here and say that I don't think that people receiving subsidized fares should receive a different colored card. It sort of creates an uncomfortable distinction. Every transit rider should look the same, and I don't think that income should be shown via your transit card, so that's not a trend I like. Again, it all comes back to the idea that if people can afford to pay for transit, they should pay for transit. And those who can't afford to pay should have free or heavily subsidized fares. I think it's even more important to note that in a lot of places where transit is really good, like let's imagine London, not charging the six-figure income worker who's riding the tube compared to the minimum income earner is just insane. And that's sort of the problem you get when you have a really good transit system and you consider, well, why don't we just make it free? You're subsidizing people who do not need that subsidy. And then of course you have the problem that if a transit system isn't all that great as is, then people who are riding it are probably already marginalized. So making transit free and disrupting the operating funding is likely to only lead to more cuts because again, these people are disenfranchised and cuts are probably more likely to happen. Point 4. Funding and operational models, particularly in North America, but in places around the world, are heavily dependent on farebox revenue. Big systems like the Toronto Transit Commission here in Toronto have really good farebox recovery ratios, meaning that the money people pay in fares goes a long way to paying for the operation of the system. Suddenly making the system free would mean that you need a huge cash injection from the government. Now, if you thought it was hard to get, 20% subsidy for transit, imagine trying to get 100% subsidy. And again, on a system like the TTC that clearly has no issue attracting riders of all income levels, why should riders with high incomes not pay a fare? All of this is to say that I'm not sure there's really a need for universal free transit in modern North America, and probably much of the world. It's the type of policy that sounds great, but it raises a lot more questions than it answers. Anyways, I want to make more videos like this where I talk about hot transit topics. My arm is really hurting. If you have any ideas for a hot topic you want me to talk about in a future video, leave it down in the comments below. I'll be talking about trackless trams. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.